What is up, guys? Welcome to another one of these vlogs where in this video I want to discuss how hard it is to get into programming, how I got into programming, and just what to expect in programming in general. So to get started, I'm going to tell you guys a short story of how I got into programming. And it's actually a very simple story. I used to be an iPhone user, and with iPhone, you don't even consider doing anything by yourself because Apple just makes it so everything is done for you. As long as you have the money to pay for the latest product, you're pretty fine with Apple. You don't need to learn how to code. You don't need to learn anything about anything. But as soon as you get to Android, you start thinking, this is really bad. It looks really ugly. The programming it just looks like something I could do myself. And I thought at that point, when I went to the Play Store and saw all of these ugly apps, I thought, why don't I just try to make my own app? I mean, it looks so simple, all it is a button, and then they charge about 10 euros for this silly button. So that's the first thing I did. I went straight to YouTube, I typed in how to make an Android app for my phone. And the first video that popped up was coding in Flow. So that's when I learned how to make a button that could increment a number up by 1. And I thought, this is a lot easier than I expected. And that's when I started diving deeper and deeper into programming, because I discovered what I had to write was not zeros and ones. It was human readable lines of text, such as function take picture or function turn on light. It is very simple and self-explanatory because you're the one who decides how complex you want it to be. Deep down, you have the power to create whatever you want from scratch, or you can use another library that's provided by Google or some other third-party service. It's up to you. All we learn to do is to put the pieces together. So then I started creating my own apps, and I thought that was a lot of fun. But at a certain point, I kind of got tired of having to rely on Google documentation because it's so specific and these skills are not transferable to other programming parts because Google decides how something should be done. And that's the only way it can be done. You can't use there's no other way to innovate it because it has to follow the Google guidelines if you want to make an Android app. And that's why I moved on to Python, because Python gives you the complete flexibility to build whatever you want. Of course, I'm using lots of packages, but it just gives you the flexibility to do what you want. You don't have to follow any guidelines. You just make a program that does what you want it to do. And that's the absolute freedom I was looking for. Of course, I imagine if you go even further back to C++ or even just go to some language that's prehistoric, you're going to have even more freedom than that because you're going to be able to tell the program at a very basic level what you want to create. But to sum up that story, I just got into programming by thinking of how I wanted to make something and Googling it. And here I am 1.5 years later working with Python, data science, and doing my best to just innovate some programs for myself, because once you learn one language and the concepts of how programs and computers work, you can build anything you want. It might not be as nice as a YouTube app or a Google app because they put years and years of experience and effort into their apps, but you still understand how they do it on a very simple level, so you can make something similar and one day build your team to be big as that. So now jumping into how hard is programming? Well, I believe programming can be as hard as you want it to be or as easy as you want it to be. If you're doing web development, it should be fairly straightforward. I found web development to be mostly graphic design orientated because you have to deal with a lot of HTML and CSS. Of course, you can start making some servers with Node and JavaScript, but more or less JavaScript just helped you with the CSS and the HTML. And then there's a lot of packages that are already made, so you don't have to worry about the complex stuff when working with web development. You just need to make a web page that your customer will enjoy looking at, because chances are your customer has no idea how programming works and they'll be happy with whatever you give to them as long as it does what it has to do. So I find that part to be very simple when it comes to programming. Then if you move on to mobile development, it's a lot more specific. You need to follow a lot more regulations on how things work. And it can be a bit tricky sometimes because there's a lot of compatibility issues since technology improves all the time on phones. So you need to be very up to date with how things work. And I still found it to be very web development orientated because you work with design a lot in there. They have editors that make it very easy to add buttons and such. But to make this compatible for the latest iPhone and for the oldest iPhone, is definitely one of the trickiest things in app development. Then you can start moving on to stuff such as data science, cybersecurity, and a lot of the backend. And that stuff starts to become more number intensive. So that's where your math might become useful. But still, throughout all of this, you're not required to know that much math. Just basic algebra will be fine, because in programming, you have lots of functions that do all the math for you. You don't need to know how to calculate the square root of something. You just need to know that the function will take care of that. And you also need to know what the square root is, but you don't need to be able to say that the square root of 4 is 2, because the program will take care of that. And same thing goes with machine learning. You're going to notice there's going to be a very complex algorithm. They're not that complex if you're good at math, but for me it was fairly complex. And in the program, it just takes literally one line of code and it will compute that whole algorithm for you, giving you the exact same result as if you were to write it out and do the math by yourself for 10 minutes. So it really depends on what you want to do, how hard the programming is going to be. To learn it is definitely not half as hard as you think. When I first started programming, I always thought it was just a bunch of zeros and ones. But of course, in 2021, we have a big layer of abstraction between the zeros and ones and the programming languages that we use. So today you can just write something in your text editor that says connect to internet, and that's going to translate into bytecode, which the computer will read. So the best way to summarize that, I would say, is that modern programming is like typing into Google Translate your original language, and Google Translate just takes care of translating it to what the other user can read. And the same thing goes for programming today. You type in take picture into the editor, and the editor is going to convert that into bytecode so that the computer can understand to take that picture. But if you're also wondering how you can get started with programming, I know I used a lot of terms that probably don't make sense at this point, and you're probably going to hear a lot of people say that it's a lot easier than it looks. And I'm sure that's true with almost everything anyone studies, but I honestly recommend you try to program a little bit every day, even if it has nothing to do with your life. It will improve your appreciation for how computers work, and you'll also soon understand that programming really isn't that hard. It's all just simple logic statements. But to sum it up, I just want to say that the greatest part of programming is that anybody can do it, and all you need to know is some basic math, and you don't need a degree for it, you don't need anything for it. You just need a computer, and you can literally write code in your text editor and make something great. It really depends on how ambitious you are to write code. Luckily today we have very powerful computers. Even if your computer is 10 years old, that's more than sufficient. But with that being said, guys, if you have any questions about programming or getting started with programming, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below, and I'll do my best to give you my advice. Otherwise, I would love to hear any advice you have to give to others. But with that being said, I wish you guys a wonderful week, and yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video.